Hi, it's Dr. Parikh. Module 3, I have a lot to say. This is where a lot of things are coming together for the chapter. Um, to be fair, I may start moving some of these a little earlier just to spread things out, or who knows, a little later. But these are originally developed for Module 3. If your to-do list puts them in a different place, then just go with that. That's fine. So the first up is talking about blame and how you can get out of typical blame patterns. So the first thing we need to acknowledge is that righteous anger feels so good. It feels so good to have the fury of the wronged and to know that you have caught someone and you can let them have it. It feels really good. It's not productive, and it typically doesn't make the relationship feel better. So when you're sitting down and having these difficult conversations, be honest and notice, you may have this fantasy of trapping someone of having someone who's kind of been treating you badly and trapping them and, forcing them to admit that they're a jerk. First of all, it usually doesn't work that way. But second of all, you're really not bringing your best self as far, it's just not a conversation that moves you forward. So if you want to move forward, you just have to give up that fantasy of being this victim who is, even if you are being kind of victimized in the situation, you just have to let go. So if you're trying to, trap someone or lawyer someone into admitting that they're wrong, if your focus is on proving that you're right, if it's about being in control or gaining the upper hand in the relationship, or just kind of showing that, you can't pull one over on me, I'm smarter than that, or some other sort of flex. If that's what you're trying to accomplish, I won't say that there's not a time and place for these sorts of things, but I think be very honest about what it is, and then think about whether you still think it's going to be effective overall. So what do you do if you're not doing any of those things in a difficult conversation? What I recommend for the vast majority of conversations, unless you are purposely saying, I am going to burn this relationship to the ground because I don't want it anymore, and even then, I don't recommend it, but certainly you can do it. But I recommend focusing on what's going to be effective, what's going to push me toward my goal in this situation. So let's imagine that you're dealing with someone in customer service. And you may be really, really mad about how you've been treated, but your goal is to get the problem resolved. If your goal is just to yell at someone for a while, then yeah, I guess that's what the person's getting paid, minimum wage to deal with. But if your goal is to get things resolved, then using more listening and empathy and starting with that sort of neutral story, those things are really effective. It's funny, my spouse and I have very different approaches to life. And so when we need to call someone with customer service, we kind of decide based on, I have a really hard time with conflict and with being what feels pushy to me. But my husband is often amazed at how I can kind of charm people. How I can just add a little bit of empathy of, oh, you must be getting lots of angry phone calls lately. Or, of course you can't do that. I totally understand. So we kind of divvy it up depending on which approach we think is needed, whether we think charm will work better or whether it is a situation that calls for a more firm, no, you didn't do what you were supposed to do and now you got to make it right. So when you're thinking about just what's going to be effective, what's going to move me toward where I want to go, it's figuring out what went wrong. So in a way, that's just what I was talking about. Figure out what kind of where is the problem? And that's, partly start with that before you, explore that a little before you sit down. But then when you sit down, that's kind of your first focus, is to figure out what happened. And then talking about what to do differently. In this case, you want to have a lot of different options on the table. Often the solution that's most effective is going to be something that neither of you have in mind when you sit down. It's easy to get caught in a tug of war of I want it my way and you want it your way. And so just opening up the options for different things is really helpful. It can be tough because we get stuck in patterns of thinking. I'll give a silly example. So my husband's family is Indian, and there's a certain order to the courses. And I am very, very, very not Indian, and I don't really understand it fully. But you start with some sort of bread, usually a flatbread, and then sort of the last course of the meal is your rice course, where you add your vegetable. They're vegetarians, so for us it's the vegetable and the kind of lentil or soup, and then you eat that. My son often doesn't really want to eat the bread course. Like, he doesn't want to eat just the plain vegetable with the bread. And so after sitting through several meals with them, I've realized that he'll eat almost anything if it's mixed in with rice. And so I said recently, we should, it's not worth fighting with him over the early stuff because he eats like a champ at the end. I said, we could just give him the rice at the beginning. And everybody just kind of politely ignored me. And then my husband laughed and said, that's no. And it doesn't matter. It's fine. It's not a big deal. But we have these, what to us feel very rigid and just the way it's supposed to be. But when you can step outside your own experience, you can see often like, well, there's no reason it has to be that way. So really challenging the things that you think have to be a certain way. Gently challenging that for the other person. But again, it's a little more difficult when it's like someone else coming in and poking yours. The other piece of how do you have a more productive conversation is that you walk in, rather than trying to pin the blame on the other person, even if you really think they are mostly responsible for it. So first of all, you have your inside thoughts and your outside thoughts. So there's this, and actually I will say that to my husband. If we're both talking to someone or with our kid or something, I'll say like, how was that productive? How is that helping? So when you want to say something and you feel your blood pressure rising, do the simple test of, is this helping or hurting? But even if you secretly in your heart of hearts think that it's like 99% the other person's fault, assume that you did something to contribute to it, or that if you had done something differently, it wouldn't have happened the same way. That's not the same as saying that it's your fault, but it's also important that we're not looking to make it their fault. And genuinely, most things are a little bit of both people's contributions. I really like that switch in language that the book recommends, going from blame to contributions. And it's this mixed bag where if you didn't contribute anything to it, then you also have no way to change the outcome in the future. If it's just the ocean washing over you, you have no way to change what happens the next day. So if you can find the place where you contributed, even if it's, if I had put my glasses over here instead of here, then my kid wouldn't have broken them. That's not to say that it's your fault that your kid broke your glasses necessarily, but it is to say that you can do something to change the outcome the next time, which is empowering. It can be really a difficult line to walk. We don't want to victim blame. We don't want to blame ourselves either. But we also want to give ourselves enough influence, enough credit, that we feel like we can make a change. So how do you retell the story? Sometimes I throw in links here. You can find them in the slides to go to more information. I don't do it too much because I could get really bogged down with it. But one thing, I am very big, I've mentioned that I really like Alfred Adler, and I also like the more broad constructivist approach. And one sort of outgrowth of that is narrative therapy, which really has an emphasis on how you tell the stories, or on using kind of storytelling as a way to take the problem outside of the person and put it out in the rest of the world, and to help the person kind of craft their own way forward. What I recommend if you are trying to change the story, especially for something that's very maybe emotionally charged or kind of ingrained, is that you retell it over and over again. And you choose your words carefully. It's like you are, carefully, it's like you're taking a hedge and trying to create, an animal shape out of it. Or I'm trying to think why I chose that instead of a sculpture. Or like you're slowly chipping away at a piece of marble. I think because I was imagining trimming, and so then I went to hedge, and then I went to an animal hedge sculpture. There's a different word for that, but I can't think of it. But same thing if you're working and sculpting something out of marble or rock. You start out with kind of the rough outline, and then you keep going over again and again, being careful and looking for what else needs to be taken away or smoothed out. So as you retell this story, and this would probably be a mix of in your head, out loud, and written down or typed out. I'm trying to do this all on camera and it's a little awkward. So you're going to do it over and over again. Notice when you have words that imply blame or judgment. Usually you can become more and more simple. The shorter, the more concise it is, often the less blaming language it has. It usually takes me 2 or 3 times through something to make it much more neutral. If it's something that's important, I ask someone else that I trust, maybe a trusted coworker or often my spouse. But if I'm really upset, it takes a while, and I usually need to set it aside for a day or two also. So the more simple you can make it, you want to use the most neutral words possible, minimizing emotions and judgment. It's important to note, I'm telling you to dial it down. We're talking about how to dial it down, but you can also dial it up just as clearly. It's important, words matter. And so, for example, the difference between saying he was murdered versus he died, that's a very big distinction. And there are times that you may want to dial it up and really emphasize that this was caused by another person intentionally. And there are times that you want to dial it down and you want to just say it more simply. And I think it's important, again, think about your purpose in the conversation. Most of the time we're talking about conflict resolution. And so we're usually trying to dial things down so that we can move forward a little easier. Often if you're using that stronger language, you may not be dealing directly with the person that you're talking about. But I just want to take a moment to emphasize, it's not that we never want to take a stand, we never want to call a spade a spade. It's that we want to be very intentional about when we do that. And that for difficult conversations, whether it's with colleagues or landlords or our most precious loved ones, often the more we can take blame and emotion out, the more we can get to the heart of what happened and how to start changing that story in the future. Because we can't really change the past. We can't understand the past, and the way we tell the story changes how we experience it moving forward. But if someone's actions hurt me, that pain happened, and knowing better what they meant now doesn't change how I felt in the moment. So it's this balance, but it does change the hurt I carry with me today and tomorrow and the next day. Another piece is just practice. Over time, notice what works well. When you ask other people, when you consult with people, notice what changes they make that are really good. I am always a big fan of surrounding yourself with people who are more skilled than you at things. Another way to intentionally retell the story is to add in the other person's perspective. We naturally center ourselves and our experience in things. It's like we all have this movie playing in our head and we're the star. And it's important to take a step back and recognize that everyone around us also has their own movie playing. and they're the star of that. So, when I go through the McDonald's drive-through, that person is, to some extent just a cog in my day's wheel, but they also have their entire whole existence. So, they might be super excited because they just went to their baby's first ultrasound and no one around them knows yet. They might be crushed because someone they love just died. They're, and all sorts of things in between of those highs and lows. So when you add in another person's perspective, part of it you can do ahead of time on your own, but you can also directly invite them to tell you their perspective. And sometimes I'll even spell out, here is what I see. Here's the evidence I have in front of me, which is also, we talked about how we have different prior knowledge, but also we can sit through the same thing. We can have the same experience, but different things stand out to us. That's why always take someone to the doctor with you if you can, especially if it's any sort of bigger thing, because the other person will remember different things than you do. But you can also directly ask them. Something I've said before is, okay, the story I'm telling myself right now is blah, blah, blah. And then I'll say something along the lines of, please help me come up with a better story. That's a very vulnerable and direct way of talking. There's only a few people in my life I would feel comfortable having that direct of a conversation with. I might say with a more professional or a more distant experience, I might say, okay, what I see has happened. From what I can see, here's what happened. Are there things you've seen that would change how I tell that story? Yeah. Narrative therapy is a really fun rabbit hole to dive down. I encourage you to look a little more at it, especially if what I talked about here about how you tell the story sounds interesting to you. That's it for this one. Thanks. Bye.